This man right here is Mr. George Soros, the 92-year-old Hungarian-born financier billionaire who set up the Open Society Foundation, endowed it with billions of dollars, which eventually flowed into different left-wing causes across the entire world. However, despite the fact that George Soros' money is behind many of the groups that we see in the news today, the fact that he bankrolled many of the district attorneys across the entire country, and despite the fact that he's consistently, time and again, the biggest campaign donor election cycle after election cycle, well, nobody knows much about him. His work is shrouded in a veil of mystery, and if you dare to talk about him publicly, well, you're apt to get labeled as being a conspiracy theorist. He is, you can rightfully say, the man behind the curtain. And so, in order to take a peek behind that curtain, I took the opportunity to sit down and interview Mr. Matt Palumbo, an investigative journalist, as well as the author of the book, The Man Behind the Curtain, Inside the Secret Network of George Soros. And because of his investigative work, he was able to offer a rare glimpse into the network set up by Mr. Soros. And so strap yourselves in, smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, and take a listen. All right, so we are here with Mr. Matt Palumbo, who is the author of this book right here, The Man Behind the Curtain, peeling back sort of the layers behind a shadowy figure, Mr. George Soros, who has become something of a, you can say, third rail in the national discussion. It's the taboo subject that you're not allowed to discuss. He funds everything, but as soon as you mention the name George Soros, well, you're cut off. Mr. Matt Palumbo, thank you so much for joining us. Yep. So let's begin at the very beginning. Let's set the stage for the audience, because I think a lot of them understand George Soros exists. He's out there somewhere. He's the shadowy figure, but you're not allowed to talk about him. So can you set the stage for us? Where did he come from, and how did he become the man that he is today?
George Soros was born closer to the beginning of the 20th century. Obviously, he's in his 90s now, ideally near the end of his life, given the record of his life. But he was born in Hungary, ended up fleeing Hungary to escape Nazis during the Holocaust. You know, there's sort of this internet myth that Soros was a Nazi. However, having said it's a myth, a very toned down version of it actually is true, and that when he was under protection in Hungary by a man his father put him under. He's only known as the Godfather. Soros and this Godfather were assigned this task by the Nazis to sort of out Jews from the local populations. This was an earlier time, pre-Holocaust, where Nazis were recruiting Jews from the local population. Many of these Jews were under this sort of false impression that maybe if they helped out in serving these deportation notices or confiscating the other goods of Jews, they would be exempt. And obviously that ended up not being true, but Soros ended up helping with this, and there's a very revealing interview in 60 Minutes where the host Steve Croft brought this up and then handed Soros on a platter the out. Well, surely this isn't something you wanted to do, surely you just went along with this, and Soros is very calm, matter-of-fact, oh no, it's something I enjoyed participating in, and if I didn't do it, someone else would have done it. Now this so-called Godfather Soros was with arguably saved his life. We at never at point during his entire life Soros ever identified this Godfather. He ended up dying a number of years ago. It wasn't until 2019 that this guy was even identified. And again, Soros never thanked the man who saved his life at all. So that's the kind of guy he is, and this is just from his teenage years. You sort of have an idea of the kind of person he is. Sorry, when it's time to go to college, he decides he wants to go to London. He goes to the London School of Economics. This is where he meets a man named Karl Popper, who created this concept called the Open Society, of which Soros' foundation is named after. Now, one of the weird things about researching this is there's this sort of Open Society Foundation on paper, and then what Soros interprets it as. And you see this with all kinds of liberal ideas. It's very rarely the case that they're stated goals and actual, the consequences are the same. So the Open Society is supposed to be, a society that emphasizes the individual, is very just open-minded, doesn't adhere to dogma. The only sort of left-wing-ish thing they throw in there in the official definition is that they promote social justice. But on paper, it's supposed to be this very libertarianish thing, and one would think it's actually sort of like what America embodies. Karl Popper himself said that he views America as the embodiment of an open society. Soros, on the other hand, says that America is the antithesis of it. So he studied another guy who coined the term. Clearly his interpretation of what an open society is quite the opposite. He is much more globalist, is much more self-serving, and ultimately narcissistic, I would argue.
Well, let me actually ask you about that, because the book that influenced him the most, according to your research, is this Karl Popper work, Open Societies and Its Enemies. If someone's not familiar with that society, from my understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, it promotes individualism,
Correct, yeah.
democracy, things like that. So from your research, how does George Soros kind of balance this relationship between this believing in a society to the point that he actually named his foundation after it, of democracy, individualism, but at the same time he works against, in a certain sense, democracy and individualism by trying to erase nation states, by trying to quash populist movements, et cetera. How does he balance those two?
Well, I would say it's sort of the left. We see this very often, where it's the claiming to be doing things on behalf of the values of the society is almost just a mask. I mean, we see this with every liberal group. It's racial justice this. They just throw the word justice onto the most random things ever. Reproductive justice than in with abortion. And it's just, with really every left-wing movement, there is what they say things are and what they really are. I mean, a very common theme for the past 20 years in particular has been words losing all meaning. We started during the Trump era. If you, let's say, even by accident called someone by the wrong pronoun, that would be violence. If an Antifa punches an old lady in the face, that somehow is not violence. I mean, you see this in legislation, where pretty much any title of a bill is an advertisement for the bill. So they were doing this with gas prices recently, where they had a bill called the anti-price gouging bill. And well, if you vote against that, you're voting for price gouging. Well, in reality, if you vote for the bill, you're voting for gas shortages. But the name it serves a purpose, and that when you report on the bill, the headline is just Republicans vote down anti-price gouging bill, and low IQ people who don't really read past the headline or don't understand basic economics are only going to see that message. And I think Soros takes advantage of that a lot. One of the things, and we'll go into the different spheres of influence, but one of the things he does in these poor countries, it's almost a sort of ideological colonialism, where he'll put NGOs in these countries, and they'll be building schools and hospitals, all these things people like. But there's always this overarching progressive tint. If they're going to say, hey, we have an area where there's no one knows anything about sex education, they'll say, we'll fill that need. But you're also getting this weird, sort of creepy, wacky, liberal, trans-inclusive version of that that did not exist even 20 years ago. So that's primarily how he operates. And I don't really think he does believe in this open society. I think it's either he's misinterpreting it wrong, or it's just a shield so he can say that's what I believe. It would be like, me saying, I'm Matt Palumbo, I stand for liberty and justice, and then anytime I do something antithetical, I go, no, I'm the justice guy. It's sort of the same thing.
All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment and introduce the sponsor of today's episode, the one, the only, My Patriot Supply, America's most trusted preparedness company. Now, I know on your list of things to do is to buy emergency food in case the inevitable happens. There are food shortages. There are global food shortages that manifest here in America. You go to your supermarket, the store shelves are empty. You know that this is a possibility and it's on your list. Buy emergency food. You just haven't gotten around to it. But there is hope, because if you head on over to preparewithroman.com, My Patriot Supply is offering an awesome deal for our viewers, for the viewers of Facts Matter. You can save $200 on their 3-month emergency food kits. And these food kits are absolutely awesome. They provide delicious meals. They provide the calories that you need right when you need it, meaning that you won't have to go hungry when other people in the country, unfortunately, might be. And so head on over to preparewithroman.com and save $200 off of each one of the 3-month emergency food kits that you buy, meaning that you can get one for yourself, your husband or your wife, and each one of your kids. That way, when things take a turn for the worst, well, you won't even have to skip a beat. You all will have your own emergency food kits filled with delicious meals that will give you the calories that you need to weather the storm. And so again, it's preparewithroman.com. Everything is in stock. It ships fast. It ships free and discreetly directly to your doorstep. And now let's head on back to the episode. Well, in that case, let me ask you then, if you think he uses this open society philosophy as sort of a shield, because some people who are cynical, they say, well, it's to amass more wealth and more power. But at the same time, I wonder, because even in your book, you said that by the time he reached the $25 million mark, when he had 25 million, he said, well, I have enough money. I want to use the rest of my life in philanthropy. Now, since then, of course, he's
got the 40 million from the, so clearly he's not really good at setting those parameters.
What would you say his goal is, though?
Well, that is the tough thing, because I mean, money itself, there's diminishing returns to how much money he can have. I mean, he's not going to spend it in one lifetime, and he seems to be using most of the money towards philanthropy. He donated close to $20 billion recently. So clearly it can't be just the money, because it's going towards these efforts. So, at risk of giving an oversimplified explanation, I think it is power for the sake of power. And, I'm very cautious, especially when you're talking about like the average Republican or Democrat, to not be like, they're motivated by malice or evil. Usually people really do what they're thinking is good, and have a misguided way of getting there. That is not true with people like George Soros, I would argue. One of the reasons I say that is because there is, I'm always asking, what's the theory when you want to do something? And I can't find it for a lot of what he's doing. The defunding the police and the local prosecutors. What is the theory? Like, okay, so you think cops are racist. You want to defund police. Tell me the process. So we have racist cops making 50 grand a year. Now they're making 40 grand a year. What changed? Okay, we have racist cops that earn marginally less money. So there's no theory behind why that would help at all. And especially with the local prosecutors, where it's okay, let's decriminalize crime. Who's helped by that? I mean, there's just no explanation. I mean, if it was one thing where it's like, hey, you can go to jail for 10 years for shoplifting, I'd go, okay, it's a bit ridiculous, but it's just basic quality of life laws that Soros is against. And as we sort of actually saw in this city back in the 80s or 70s through 90s, really, once you stop enforcing things like laws against graffiti, public homelessness, public drinking, public drug use, public gambling, you invite a certain type of person to that area. And you also just sort of, normal everyday people tend to avoid certain areas, and it's just a recipe for crime and lawlessness and further destruction, and it causes people to not respect the law. And a large part of what Rudy Giuliani did when cleaning up the city was all these things that seem unrelated, like there's a murder crisis, but we're getting rid of the squeegee men and graffiti and open prostitution. But what happens then is normal people come out in the middle of the day and at night, and then there's really not as much opportunity to commit crimes. So that's why I just can't. There's no. He can't even give a pretend motive that makes sense to me. So that's why I would say in his case, I actually do think it's actual malice.
Interesting. Yeah. And then before we move on from discussing his philosophy, the last question I had is in regards to this open society that he's trying, at least statedly trying to build. What does that look like? Based on at least the writings and based on maybe the stated mission goal of his foundation, when can he say that, yes, I've achieved the open society? What does that end goal look like?
Well, that's the thing about left-wing activism, is it's deliberately open-ended. It is set up in a way where it can never end and will always perpetuate. So Black Lives Matter, for instance, will go, as long as there's one unarmed black person or armed black person being killed by police, we have a movement. Well, there's 50 million black people in the country, there's 700,000 cops. There are billions of interactions every day. By random chance, there is going to be at least one incident per year for the end of time, and the movement will be able to exist. The gay rights movement is another example. They were big on marriage, equal treatment. Very successful campaign. We pretty much have both of those things. In marriage, obviously, of course, most people are relatively tolerant of gays. And then the narrative just shifts. It's shifted. We got to see this with the transgender movement, where it's trans rights, and what rights do transgender people not have? No one can give me one answer, but this is just a new thing we have to perpetuate. Or movements will shift. I mean, we sort of see this with, actually another example of the gay rights movement, where back in the 1980s, it was considered homophobic to say that AIDS is a gay disease, because you're unjustly maligning a population because a majority of cases in the population. Now, in the year 2022, it's homophobic to not say it's a gay disease because it disproportionately affects them, and if it's killing them disproportionately, well, you wouldn't want to take that away from that group. So even their standards will shift to accommodate a cultural shift, and so that the movement will never end. And it's just very common. You could even say it with environmental activists, where once we get carbon emissions below what they want it to be, it's always going to be a little bit more. We have a life with trade-offs. There's always going to be pollution. There's going to be murder. Other sorts of crimes, and they can always argue for doing one more thing to bring it down. But as you do that, there's just more and more diminishing returns. It gets more and more costly to fight a problem the more you reduce it. There is actually no end goal. And if they meet it, the goalpost is going to move. That will be hit. It'll move again. Prior achievements will be reframed in a way. I think civil rights is the big example, where our civil rights activists today speak about the modern day as if it's a Wednesday in Mississippi in 1863. There's no linear time is constantly blurred, there's just no end to it ever.
Let's talk about the method then. The Open Society Foundation is something that everybody knows exists. Everybody knows a lot of money gets doled out of it. But again, it's like the same thing as George Soros. It's the third rail. And I remember in October of 2017, Trump was about a year into his presidency, and I came to the office, and on the table was that day's Wall Street Journal, and it said, front page above the fold, George Soros donates $18 billion to Open Society. And I remember reading that, and I looked around the office. I'm like, this is huge. This is it was
the biggest charitable in quotes, contribution of all time, from what I read. Yeah.
But then afterwards, no news, nothing. It's like it disappeared into the void. Let's talk about the Open Society Foundation. What are the origins of it? What is it, and how does it actually operate?
Well, the origins was, as we stated, George Soros, once he made a certain amount of money, decided I'm going to never make any more money, and then made a ton more money. But as part, founded the Open Society Foundation, and it's almost like a conglomerate of a charity, where it has global operations. They've got chapters in various countries that are basically NGOs. Then here it finances the Soros media empire, and then also spends a lot of money on candidates. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. And to touch on the charitable donation, one of the big parts of that's sort of been swept under the rug, which I find surprising in the current culture where everyone's aware of billionaires not paying taxes, is it gave him sort of this double tax dodge, where he has money in one pocket, and when you're a billionaire, you've got a lot of stocks and bonds. Those increase in value over time, but you don't pay tax until you sell them. So he dodged all the taxes on them by donating them to his own foundation, because the capital gain doesn't get realized. It gets transferred over to the private charity. And then for 5 years, he gets to write off that $19 billion against his taxes. So he pays no tax for 5 years. But it's not like a normal write-off where you're spending money and then sort of getting reimbursed by the government. He's literally moving money from one pocket to the other and getting a tax write-off on both ends. So I think that's itself a very big story, and I don't really think anyone really covered that much.
So then the Open Society Foundation, so what is the structure actually like? So is George Soros still sort of overseeing the entire thing?
Officially, but it looks like his son Alexander Soros is really the one running the show right now. Yeah, I mean, he's 91, 92 years old, so it's just, I imagine at that age you're limited physically.
And so then Alexander Soros, his son, is sort of at the top overseeing the Open Society chapters in all these different countries. And then let's say the one in America. Is there a different chapter in each state?
Not that I'm aware of. I believe it's just the New York based, and then it's from there. It's sort of like an octopus where the money is just going to thousands of different causes he wants. And actually, one of the parts of the book people really liked a lot was at the end, I just have 20 or 30 pages where I just have a table of every notable group he's ever donated to, and it's a sort of description of them, just so people, when they see a group and want to know who's behind it, can just kind of go through the index and see if it's there.
Can you give us some interesting examples?
I mean, Acorn was a big one. I remember James O'Keefe, kind of his rise to fame. The Tides Foundation, as I stated. A lot of not Black Lives Matter directly, but Black Lives Matter adjacent groups where it's sort of like just a clone of BLM. I don't know why he chose those groups over others. A lot of groups in the Ferguson protests he funded. There was a $1 million campaign he funded to try to stop Glenn Beck, get him off Fox, that he funded through Media Matters. Just all these random little things where his name's popping up.
You said thousands, right? Thousands of these.
Yeah, I mean, in the list, I only have I think it's in the hundreds. I mean, if I had literally every group he's ever given at least $1 to, it would be longer than the entire book. So I just focus on the big ones. But yeah, I've got a couple hundred in there.
How do you think from your research, how does this process work? Let's say I am, I'm a on the ground Antifa soldier, and someday I say, you know what? I'm tired of smashing these windows. I want to start my own organization to, advance social justice. How do I get that Soros money? Do I apply for it? How does that work?
Yeah, so there is, I mean, most of it's just, I guess, already established things. But yeah, you can go on the website, you can apply for a grant, and I guess if you need some windows broken, he'll maybe help fund that. Yeah, he seems to fund a lot of just sort of people on the top. Like, it's, if you were to say Soros funds Antifa, it's not directly like, hey, you're an Antifa guy, here's money. It's certain activist groups. I know I have the names in there. I can't recall one off the top of my head, but we're from the activist groups, and that's why they all have these matching signs and $300 batons they're waving around. But he's not funding them directly. It's the people above them that are sort of the sort of overseers. I get it. Which strategically that would sort of make the most sense. You have a very controlled and a hierarchy above these crazies you're funding.
Yeah, and then I imagine that either George or Alexander, they can't possibly be reviewing every single application. So do you know what the inside of the organization actually looks like? Do they just have a driving ethos that this is our worldview, this is what we want to advance, and if your application kind of jives with that, we'll fund you?
Yeah, I would assume it's more like that. I mean, one of the reasons I don't know the exact process is there was actually a study, and I think it was 2016 or 17, by a group called Transparify. It was just looking at transparency in various charitable organizations, and the Open Society Foundation was ranked the #1 least transparent organization. I mean, obviously there's reporting requirements you have to obey, but yes, they're very secretive. Mailed them a copy of my book, have not heard back, so maybe they're not a fan, but.
Interesting. The open society is very closed.
It's very close, which goes to my things. They don't actually believe it.
That's fascinating. Yeah. In your book, you gave one example about the Ferguson protest. Can you set that stage and tell the audience that story?
Yeah, so he funded a lot of groups that just pushed the lie that Michael Brown had his hands up and said don't lie, don't shoot. Funded just a lot of these groups that took to the streets and in effect burnt down Ferguson. And they all have nice sounding names like Movement for Black Lives and Justice this, Justice that. But as we see in reality, that's what they're doing. And yeah, I mean a lot of what Soros does, and to sort of go on a bit of a tangent, in the intro where I talk about his philosophy, there's this concept in finance called reflexivity that he created. And it's a very brilliant concept in that he notes that in financial markets, expectations will often create realities. And you see this all throughout history, whether it be tulip bulbs or the housing market in 07 and 08 or GameStop stock in last year for whatever reason, that if people think something's going to happen, it actually will happen. Obviously, the opposite might happen way after as the market corrects, but expectations set reality. And Soros realized, well, that's true of media as well. If you tell people what to expect, they're going to reinterpret reality in that effect. So whether it be the hands up, don't shoot, where when you're first to the story, the correction usually doesn't get heard. So they spread that lie. The reality is that never happened, but it doesn't matter. We saw this during the George Floyd protests, where we were all told if we leave our houses, we're killing grandma because of COVID. And then we're all watching what I think it might have been as much as 30 million people took to the streets, and we're going, well, this can't be good for COVID. And then as that's happening, all these articles are coming out going, all right, so listen, there might be a spike in COVID cases in 2 weeks, but here's the real reason. Knowing that these dumb liberals obviously don't want to believe they're responsible, but so they'll go, oh, this complete nonsensical reason, that's the real reason that coincides with all us screaming outside. So yeah, so that's a big thing, is just setting the narrative. I mean, the biggest one, and I think you'll probably ask about this because I get asked this in every question, is how the heck is it that we can't criticize George Soros? Comedians are always saying, you're supposed to, or the liberals are always saying like about comedians, oh, you got to punch up, you can't punch down. Well, this is punching up. He's got, over his lifetime, made $40 billion and has an enormous amount of influence and had 500 A-list celebrities at his wedding. So I would think he's fair game. And what he's taken advantage of is just this sort of narrative where any disagreement of the left is categorized as racism. And he's lucky because he gets his own category of racism. He can say it's anti-Semitic, which is often viewed as even worse than just general racism, given the recentness of the Holocaust, which he played no role in preventing. So that's his main thing. And in the media chapter of the book, I have a list of publications that are linked to Soros. The way I link it, and I didn't want it to be like he knows a guy who knows a guy. I made it where if you are on a group that gets a significant amount of Soros money, but ideally literally a Soros group, and you're on the board, and then you're also work for a media organization, I say you're Soros linked. And just go on any of the publications that are Soros linked, ABC, CBS, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times. I mean, the list is a very long list. Type in Soros's name and just look at how they cover him. And it's always, if it's ever anything negative, it's anti-Semites say negative claim, or it's a very common theme of the media. I think the Washington Post and the Hill sort of pioneered this, where if a Republican does something wrong, the story is the Republican doing something wrong. If a Democrat screws up and does something wrong, the story is Republicans pounce on Democrats doing whatever. It's always framed as the right-wing outrage over them doing something wrong to try to make it seem like, oh, well, it can't be that big a deal, but just get a load of these people who are upset about it. So that's just another reframing technique that's been very big. And in this case, it's been to say criticizing Soros is somewhat anti-Semitic, even though he's not a practicing Jew. And I would be surprised if more than 50% even knew he was Jewish. I don't think that's the first thing anyone looks up on a person, but what do I know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's really a brilliant strategy. You have this idea that you want to get out into the world. You have this worldview that you want to achieve. Mm-hmm. You control the leaders of the people on the ground. Yeah. Then they do something, but what's reported is reported by the media, who you also control. Yeah. And that narrative then translates back down to the people who are actually on the ground doing what they're doing.
There are even journalism watchdogs, like the Columbia Journalism Review, that Soros is linked to and he gives money to. So even the watchdogs of the journalists are in many cases Soros funded.
Can you give us some concrete examples? How is it specifically that George Soros has so many of people that are linked to him inside of the media? Can you give us like a few concrete examples of how that plays out? Let's say like within the New York Times, you said that there are people linked to George Soros. What does that actually look like?
It would just be, so we have, okay, suppose I'm on an Open Society Foundation board, or I'm on a board of a company that gets the majority of its funding from the Open Society Foundation. I then also have either currently or at some point later in my life then go work for CNN or CBS. So it's just, I've taken Soros money before, either currently or in the past. Now I work for media, and it's inevitable they're going to be reporting on this guy. It's sort of like, and Glenn Greenwald, I think, or actually, I might even Noam Chomsky, ironically, who obviously I'm not a fan of, but he made the point, like in media, when the media is dictating control, it doesn't have to be me going, hey, you work for me, you say this. It's you respond to incentives. If you work at a publication, they might not tell you what to report, but you might just notice, okay, people who report on these issues get promoted and people who report on these kind of get sidelined. Similar thing there. It's sort of an implied contract where I've gotten money from this guy before. Am I really going to badmouth him in my report? And a lot of people just, choose not to. Plus, they're ideologically benefit from portraying him as just a right-wing boogeyman. Because, if you can dismiss any of his funding as that, then you don't have to really address it. And that happens to me with the book, too. It's just you're promoting a boogeyman, and I'm going, well, I have the list here, but, they don't want to listen.
Yeah, one example that I thought you gave in the book that elucidated this point quite well is ProPublica.
Oh, yeah, I could go on that if you want. Yeah, so they did a very lengthy report on billionaires not paying taxes. And to be fair, it was kind of a BS report. It was just, hey, they have a ton of stock, the stock went up, they didn't pay tax on it. Well, they don't pay tax until they sell. So you can build in a deferred tax into their net worth. But what was interesting about the report is you read every person. You got Bill Gates, you got Zuckerberg, you got Bezos. A couple thousand words, at least more than 500 words per person. Very in-depth, here's what they own, here's why not. You get to George Soros, and there's like one full paragraph, and then like a 2 or 3 sentence paragraph. The first paragraph is saying, okay, he paid no tax from these years. However, his representative, and I don't recall him having representatives reach out from the other people, but his did, says, oh, we didn't make money because we didn't pay taxes because our fund didn't make any money that year. Now, Soros' fund is big enough. If you make more than $100 million a year, if you manage more than $100 million, you have to report with the SEC. So anyone can just look up his profit and loss, and he turned a profit those years. So they didn't even do, I'm sure they did do the due diligence, but didn't report it. But they made no mention of the fact that that excuse was a lie. The real reason was, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, he donated 18 or 19 billion to himself, and that gave him a write-off for 5 years. So he didn't have to pay any tax, but they didn't, I guess, want to admit that.
And how was ProPublica, who reported this story, connected to George Soros?
Oh, yes. So he accounts for about 2% of their funding. And they've actually dismissed allegations that he plays any role by going, well, he only controls 2% of our funding. And, well, apparently that's a significant amount, enough to change our coverage and not to do basic due diligence. So.
Well, 2% of
a company, if you hired 2% of McDonald's, you'd have quite a bit of influence. So if it's anything really.
So we talked about the Open Society in regards to media. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the Open Society in regards to politicians and political campaigns. So there's been a lot of talk recently about George Soros DAs, right? Can you lay that out? Why? Well, first of all, which cities did he install DAs? What does him installing DAs look like? And then furthermore, why is he targeting DAs?
Actually, I'll start with the reason why he's targeting them. And it's really the easiest way to get policy reform done, because if you want, let's say, less bail, more lenient sentencing, you want these crimes prosecuted and these not, to do that through legislation is quite a process. You have to do everything individually. You're going to get a lot of opposition. If you elect a DA, they have total autonomy on all those things. So it's just, hey, I want the law changed. I back a guy who wants to change it exactly the way I do. He goes in, he changes it overnight. So one of the weirdest things actually about this whole DA thing is these prosecutors are household names. In a country where most people don't even know their representative, sadly enough, or their mayor, but they know who Chase Boudin is in San Francisco, or Amir Ayala in Florida, with the McCloskeys, the family that had the iconic photo of them with the guns. Rachel Rollins in Massachusetts, who is, I don't think she's as well known, but trust me, completely insane. Kim Fox in Chicago with, notably got the Jesse Smollett charge dropped, and then, that went from there. But the whole chapter, I make it like almost like baseball stats, where I just have, here's the guy, here's how much money they got, here's what they campaigned on, and here's the results. And it's really the same story in every case, except maybe one I found was just an anti-death penalty guy, but not otherwise radical. But everyone else was radical in a very much a similar vein, a similar theme. So Soros, in presidential elections, he donates hundreds of millions, but there's billions of dollars being spent, so it's harder to move the needle. But when you're in a DA race and there's a couple $100,000 spent in each person normally, and then you drop 1 or 2 million, it actually does. You actually can buy an election that way, and it's happened time and time again. In fact, there are cases where the challenger just drops out because they know there's no point. But it's so. For instance, like Chesapeake in San Francisco, the weekend crime philosophy, it's always misrepresented as, well, hey, we don't want people to go to jail for smoking pot, or hey, some people need mental health treatment, or hey, people might be feeding their families, we don't put them in jail. And some of it may sound good on paper, but it's just in practice, it's not what happens. In practice, we see cases where clearly violent and mentally ill people will not even face bail. These people are places are doing out with bail entirely, and then they just go out and reoffend. Or in many cases in San Francisco have gone on and killed people. In fact, the entirety of the spike in hate crimes against Asians is attributable to Chesapeake's policies. And in many cases, it's a very concentrated problem of these repeat offenders who they will not put in jail, just doing it again and again and again. And it seems like he's probably going to be one of the first to get recalled, fortunately. So that's one notable example. Kim Gardner's another one where we have a case where Black Lives Matter activists break into a gated community, so they broke the law doing that. They're threatening to murder this couple as they're outside their house. They grab guns, which I don't even know if they were loaded or operational. I can't remember that detail. But a very common theme of these activists is they view criminals as the real victims. You'll see this like on a social media post. Someone's robbing a Chanel store, and some liberals going, "Well, they might be feeding their family." And I'm going, "With that? Like, sorry guys, I don't buy it in that case. If they're stealing bread, I might buy it." But that's one of the things where the victims themselves become the criminals. And one thing that comes to mind recently was there was this viral video of a woman getting attacked in the New York subway, and people were saying, well, why isn't anyone going to help? Was it like a death of masculinity? And I'm saying, well, that could be a role, but it could also be the case that if you intervene, somehow you're portrayed as the bad guy. You're the one who faces consequences. There are countries like the UK where if you defend yourself with even a toy gun, if someone breaks into your house, you'll also be charged. So it's a breakdown of law and order we're seeing, and almost every single one of these cities, and defund the police has been very big with these people. We've seen pretty much a doubling in crime just in 2020 through 2021. There's really no sign of things slowing down. And then all these little quality of life things that you don't even really think about. Just not having a homeless camp outside of your home, not having graffiti everywhere, not having public drunkenness. These things are just becoming more and more common and more accepted, and then the activists just dismiss it as, oh, well, this is proof we need more housing shelters. Every negative consequence they create is reframed as, here's why we need to do some left-wing policies. We see this in San Francisco, where they don't build any houses, and then so they have all these homeless people, and they go, well, we need to build more public housing, where it's going to cost them like $1 million per person. And it's just their own policies perpetuate the need for more of the same policies that do nothing.
Let me ask you this. So as you were going through all those examples, I wonder, because George Soros is not, and I'm sure Alexander Soros, they're not dumb people.
No, he's a very smart guy, which is unfortunate for us.
He can see these effects. He can see what's happening on the ground, and yet he continues to push in this direction. Do you think that and so I guess my question is twofold. One is, does he not care, for one? Or two, is the goal the chaos, so that out of the chaos, something new can emerge and replace the system of the U.S.?
I think that's it. I've been trying to speculate overall what's the goal of the defund the police movement, because one of the things I've noticed, and I'm surprised this hasn't been reported more, is that a lot of these places that defunded the police have at least partially refunded them in recent years, but they've done so quietly. They haven't mentioned it at all. So it's they want to accommodate activists by doing something crazy. They realize it's insane, this can't go on, and then they refund it quietly. So they know something's up. So I'm going, so why are politicians still pushing it? And one theory, and I don't know if this ties with Soros in particular, but one theory for why they would push to fund the police is an effort to federalize the police, to give states less autonomy. In fact, there was recently an anti-lynching bill that sort of served that goal, where lynchings are now federal crimes. And there were liberals talking about it as if lynching was legal up until that point. And it's like, no, we have laws against murder that falls into that category. It's a state offense. There's no need to make it more than it is. But one of the consequences is it does make it federal. And I'm wondering, is that the goal with everything else? Just federalize the police, give less autonomy to the states. It would be the more globalist thing to do. I mean, that is... we're almost a mini EU, where the federal government's our EU, and we're our own little sovereign states to some extent, and that's antithetical, even that, to Soros' philosophy.
Well, actually, when you were talking about federalizing the police, I think that ties in well to another topic that I wanted to discuss, which is the federalization of elections. Because George Soros also funded quite a bit into the 2020 election with the changing of all the different policies. Can you talk a bit about that? Can you set the stage for the audience about what he was pushing in 2020?
Well, a lot of what he was pushing, and is obviously COVID helped a lot, was the whole vote by mail initiatives. And it obviously made it way more susceptible to fraud. I saw the Dinesh D'Souza film. But even if you weren't planning fraud, it is just intuitive that it would give liberals a boost. Because, what do we know about young people? One, they're very liberal overall. B, they don't vote. So it's, the most, the sort of, if you look at people throughout their lives, they become more right-wing over as they get older, and they also tend to vote more. So, you have all these kids that didn't like Trump or just, reluctantly didn't like the guy and were going to vote for Biden, where normally they wouldn't spend 30 minutes getting up, driving to the polling booth and voting. Instead, they get mailed something in the mail and go, oh, okay, I can check a box and it's over with. So it did bring in all these new voters who, generally speaking, were always going to vote left if they did vote, but normally wouldn't vote, which I would say is something of an unfair advantage. There was no counterbalance on the right or anything. So that was a big one. He also, this was back in 2005, started something called the Secretary of State Project, and this was sort of his first foray into local politics, because he was inspired to try to stop the whole Florida situation back with Bush versus Gore from happening again. So actually his first foray into local politics was trying to prevent Republicans from correctly winning another election in that situation or scenario.
All right, so then since we're discussing young people, a lot of them are, of course, in college and the university, which has also received a lot of funding from the Open Society Foundation. Can you touch a bit about how the Open Society Foundation uses the George Soros money to influence higher education?
Yeah, so Soros actually has founded his own college. There's one, it was started in Hungary called Central European University back in, I believe it was the 80s. But it was really his first attempt at driving the narrative through a, I guess, more respectable format. One of the things you notice about the school is the faculty to student ratio is something like 3 to 1, meaning 75% of people there are actually teachers or researchers. Normally it's like, 10 students for every professor or even more. And I think it's just because most of they're really think tanks masquerading as universities. One of the things about Central European University too is it is a truly hideous building in the center of Budapest. Almost people who've been there said it's almost like a middle finger to the rest of the beauty of the city. And I think that's deliberate. Now, it doesn't operate anymore because Viktor Orban, who ironically once got a Soros scholarship to be a law student, decided liberalism was not for him, went to the not far right, but more, I would say to the right of the average Republican, is not afraid to use state power to advance his goals, and launched a very big anti-Soros campaign in his country. There was billboards. If you walked into a bus, you'd be stepping on a photo of his face printed on the floor. That set the stage to really just turn the public against him, and then once the public was against him, he could start acting on it, and just basically effectively kicked him out of the country. So that was his flagship university. It's now in Vienna. There's about, I think, 20 or so that he funds very heavily that I have listed in the book. The one in America that he funds the most is called Bard College, which is partnered with Central European University. Now, the one, I guess, caveat is, how is this different than every other crazy liberal university? And actually, it's really not that much different. I would just say it exists more to serve his specific agenda. But in terms of ideology, you look at the coursework, it's the craziest stuff you've ever read, but you could also go on, Cornell's, and it's some wacky stuff there too. But he's pouring more gasoline on the fire, and that is the insanity of higher education. So it seems like, in terms of higher education, it's not been such a big push, a big focus of the Open Society Foundation, you would say? No, I can't think of any, or at least couldn't find any big studies that came out that were these huge policy-changing things. But he does have them out there. Most academia doesn't really get elevated to a national level or anything, but he does have all these institutions that do promote his ideology.
I think recently more and more schools, especially under the college level, the kindergarten, middle school, high schools, have been getting some national publicity due to CRT as well as sort of this like sexualized education. Did you find any connections to George Soros or his money in any of that?
Not any of that, actually. I mean, it is sort of, the whole, I'm sure the Libs of TikTok account you're familiar with, they did a very good job at exposing that. That hasn't really been on my radar until currently. So I haven't found anything directly there, but I would not be surprised if activist groups that sort of share the ideology do it. But it does seem like, at least from the what Libs of TikTok is finding, is it's sort of individual actors who are, I guess, kind of crazies or eccentrics who are getting no pushback and probably should in any civilized society.
So besides all the DAs you mentioned and what they're doing, how much influence does George Soros have in the overall government, maybe at the state and national level?
I did a section on his influence in the Biden White House, and a lot of it is like people like Neera Tanden and Ron Klain, two obviously higher ups in Biden advisors, work for the Soros-linked Center for American Progress, so there's some influence there. Obviously, Soros was a big donor to Obama, so he obviously sort of has some residual influence over Biden. And the Secretary of State is another, Antony Blinken is another big one. In fact, one of the first things he did after taking office was he sanctioned Albania's first non-communist president, Sali Berisha, who was a very prominent Soros critic. Soros tried to infiltrate his country. Berisha kind of realized what was going on and said no. So the two had a very bitter rivalry for quite a while. And then, the second, Blinken, who I should mention, his parents are donors for the Open Society Foundation. There was actually a library at the aforementioned Central European University named after him. And if you go through the Open Society Foundation's annual reports, both their names pop up there in the hierarchy. So Blinken's probably one of the big ones. And there's just been historical influence too. For instance, under Bill Clinton, Soros had a lot of influence in this sort of initiative to help Russia transition from communism to capitalism, where Soros more or less was able to sort of paint himself as this anti-communist hero, while his real goal was just buy up state assets for pennies on the dollar. And then there's also with the Hillary Clinton as well. In addition to Bill Clinton, I have a chapter in there where I have like leaked Soros emails, and there are various ones with Clinton where he'll say like, "Hey, I think this guy would be the best person for this position," and then the next day in the news, what do you know? She appoints that person. So those are the ones that come to mind.
Oh, so then it seems like if that's the case, if he recommends someone the next day it happens, it seems like he has some deep ties.
Yeah, or one heck of a coincidence, but yeah, I think it's some direct influence there.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah. And so when you said that the chief of staff, Ron Klain, he worked for a foundation that receives, you said, is linked to Soros, so they receive funding from the Open Society?
Yeah, Center for American Progress. It's a very big, they were actually a lot bigger like a decade ago, but a very big lefty think tank. I think Neera Tanden might have even been on the board, but yeah, it receives a very large share of their funding from him. And
So in that scenario, like, how do you think that affects the decisions or his influence there? Do you just think it's like an ideological alignment, or more than that? What do you think?
Well, I mean, in your everyday life, 99% of the time, it's just we have this connection because we share the same ideology. But also, it's if there ever is anything that does involve Soros, I mean, they I don't know if they literally have the guy's phone number, but they the guy. He's funded you. You know him. He's a contact. In fact, and this is a little off topic, but there was a document. Actually, no, it's not off topic. It's a document leaked from him, the Open Society Foundation, and it was sort of like a dossier or like a Rolodex of all his contacts in the European Parliament. It was 277 people, which out of a parliament of 705 would mean that if you made Soros-backed MPs a political party, they'd be the biggest political party in the EU Parliament. And it just has all these facts in them. Contact, fax, cell, email, why we align, what issues we align on. And my first thought was, well, what does that look like for the U.S. government? And I'm sure that document must be somewhere. So, maybe that'll come out in the future. But if he's got, what is that? I mean, nearly more than a quarter of European Parliament in his arm, I imagine you see a very similar list for America.
Well, you said it'll likely come out, but even if it comes out, maybe we won't even see it because that's what happened in 2016.
Yeah, they'll say it's a Hunter Biden laptop thing. They'll just find some way to excuse to bury it or say it's fake or something, but we'll believe it.
Actually, so 4 years before the Hunter Biden laptop, that's what happened with the Soros documents, right? In 2016, they were leaked on that web. I forgot what the website's
DC
name.
Leaks or something. It sounded like WikiLeaks. I think it was like DC Leaks or something.
But then it got killed. No media reported on it.
The Daily Caller got it, and that was really it. No one else followed up.
Was there anything that was revealed in those leaks that you can share with us?
Oh yeah, so I actually have a whole chapter on it. I mean, one of the things that I thought was the most interesting was just sort of the psychology of why they support organizations. So like, there was one where their whole goal was to make it so Catholics would be more likely to vote Democrat. So they're like, what do we do? I mean, abortion's a huge issue for them. So they decided on the strategy of reframing, where it's, all right, we need to infiltrate a Catholic organization. And I think it was actually like I can't remember if they openly were pro-life, but they infiltrated a Catholic organization and were trying to get it to repitch the goals to voters as like, well, abortion is one of many issues. So, hey, it might be the case that we're all pro-life, but if the Democrats are bigger on these other 4 issues, well, we got to vote Democrat. And then the group kind of caught on and did away with it. But it was just interesting. This actually didn't make it into the book, but there was the Daily Caller reported on it. It was after the book came out. A right-wing environmentalist group that was funded by Soros. And well, why would Soros fund a Republican environmentalist group? Well, it's reframing. It's a Republican will go, well, I guess if you can, it's sort of taking advantage of this psychology where if you hear an idea that conflicts your ideology from someone who shares it, like if Tucker Carlson says pitches something that's maybe fiscally left of center, it's generally more well received by Republicans than if Obama said it. Sort of picking up off that, where they're hoping they can go, well, hey, if it's a Republican issue, then if it can be seen as a Republican issue too, then maybe people on the right will come along to our side. But really, we're just basically screwing with them psychologically. So that's just one thing I thought was sort of interesting. The EU Parliament leak was also very big, and then a lot of stuff is just these little tiny things that just kind of give insight into their operations and all that.
So we discussed his ideology. We discussed his foundation, how it's using quite literally billions of dollars and a replenishing source of billions of dollars, because he of course has his fund to fund all these different DAs, these different politicians, the media and the actual people on the ground doing some of the violence. However, George Soros is 91 years old, and he looks it, right? Yeah. He's likely not going to be here for the next 10 years. I mean, I don't wish anything bad on anyone, but at the same time, you're 91. So the question is, how do you, based on your research, expect his ideology and what he set up to continue after he's gone?
Right, so I think it was actually decades ago, expressed concerns that foundations often stray from their founders. And he was initially reluctant to really keep the foundation going. However, in 2017, that $18 or $19 billion donation, given he was in his late 80s at the time, does signal that's what the point is. It's succession planning. It's to get into that balance sheet so it can continue. It seems like his son, Alexander, is going to be sort of taking the mantle. It seems like he's second in command right now. And I think it'll sort of be more of the same. It might just be what he focuses on is different, but he's more or less a clone of the father. There doesn't seem to be any, ideological difference or anything like that. Obviously his father may have more connections than he does currently, but if his son's at this for the next 50 years, I'm sure he'll be just as powerful, unfortunately.
And then the last question. So in terms of amassing his wealth, George Soros is famous for the man who broke the Bank of London, right? He played within the rules, within the boundary of the rules that existed. He took that to the extreme and pretty much almost crashed the entire economy of England. It seems like the same thing is playing out in the political sense here, at least here in America. He is funding all the different grassroots organizations on the ground. He's funding the media that reports on them. He's funding the actual DAs who are then releasing these people back into the streets. So it's like kind of a self-perpetuating circle. So it almost seems like he's playing the same game. He's playing within the rules, because you're allowed to use your money for whatever you want to use it for, to also break down society. That's what it seems like to me. What is the solution here? Hungary instituted those anti-George Soros laws. That's a bit, maybe, what's your opinion? That's a bit extreme, but what do you think is the solution?
Well, the First Amendment obviously prohibits that. But that was a very good analogy you gave. I wish I thought that up for the book. But yeah, so we are obviously handicapped in that regard. We can't do what, Russia or India have done and see his asses and kick them out. But I would just, my whole goal of the book is just have it be everyone, sort of demystify the man. Just have it, there are certain things where if I want to prove a point to a liberal, I can't cite Fox News, even if it's 100% true, because they'll just go, oh, that's Fox News, that's BS. So I have to find, all right, where's a non-biased source that says the exact same thing? I want Soros' name to be the same thing, where the second someone hears a Soros-backed group is behind something, they go, oh, it's just Soros, it's crazy stuff. I just really think being as knowledgeable as possible about who he is and his influence, the kind of narratives he promotes and why they're completely false, I mean, just more awareness of who the guy is. You know, maybe an ad campaign would work, but yeah, obviously we're handicapped in directly thwarting his operations. Although, you know, they are, as I said, the least transparent charities. So perhaps there is, you know, an in for regulators to see maybe something's up here. But I haven't seen any evidence that there is.
Matt, thank you so much for joining
Thank
us.
you.